All right. So to mimic ashes to ashes, I guess I'll start off by asking, where are you?
um, I am in Los Angeles and Topanga, California,
Okay.
um, which is unceded territory of Tongva and Chumash peoples.
Hmm.
Um, and I live here with my partner and our 3-year-old.
Beautiful. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Um, Very nice. So what can you tell us about the history behind your work as an artist or yeah, what can you tell us about that history?
Um, well, I guess for me, my that history is a training in photography and filmmaking, with a big interest in documentary,
Hmm.
um, but also but a part of my interest in documentary, I was thinking about it before we talked, that part of that interest in documentary was more experimental forms that didn't take what you see on the surface at face value and were suspicious of the image,
Hmm.
as and look to strategies for how to think beyond the ways in which images are already kind of pre-programmed to mean things culturally in
Yeah.
ways that are connected to power, and so how to unthink the image at the same time as building new ones and so forth.
Gotcha. Can you elaborate a bit on how to unthink the image or what that means?
And a lot of the work that Ashes has evolved out of, um, is is very landscape based.
Hmm.
So the project Degrees of Visibility, which is like a decade long documentary project engaging uh, over 260 different sites in which prisons, jails, and detention centers sit around the U.S. and its territories, all 50 states. Um, that's landscape based, and for me, there's a way in which landscape has a it shows us something literally, right? Optically, it shows us something, but then it also kind of triggers a set of meanings that we already believe around what landscape means to us,
Hmm.
whether those are nationalist ideas or kind of gendered ideas of, in the US, rugged masculinity, um, or space being empty as opposed to historically being quite full of people, in a way that corresponds to kind of frontier ideology and
Hmm.
um, allows settler colonial ideas of taking over empty space to um, to be quite easy to believe.
Gotcha.
Um, so those kinds of erasures are very much a part of what I've I've tried to work against. Uh, the traditional sense of documentary is just, here's this majestic mountain and let it fill you with majesty.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, uh, and so there's an unthinking there. It's like,
Hmm.
what else? What am I not seeing, and what does that mean? So I think there's also critiques of photography within colonialism, critiques of photography and documentary within uh, throughout. I mean, I guess thinking about kind of nationalist frameworks, representations of state parks and things like that.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of thinking about what does it mean to, what is degrees of visibility, is very much based in um, not showing what prisons look like, but engaging photographically with the ways in which they're concealed from the public.
Ah.
And so the question of what does it mean for that concealment, camouflage, and erasure to be used aesthetically, but in an aesthetic way that is about power, um, and concealing what the state does or erasing people. Um, uh, that's a very important part of how I've been thinking about that.
Gotcha. And so you use a lot of like looking through Ashes to Ashes. It's almost purely images of natural settings and like nature
Mm.
landscapes. And I guess looking at, I forget the title of your most recent work, but it also um, builds off of similar ideas where you kind of photograph images around where the prisons are, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
So, what do you think about, I guess, the power dynamic of nature? And nature is something that we're working with and like living with, and the ways in which people have kind of built nature to oppress one another or like use nature or use these environments to oppress one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, I think there's a few different ways to approach that. Maybe just really quickly, the title for Ashes Ashes doesn't have the two in the middle.
Ah,
Um, so I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but if you're going to use, I don't know if your voice will be in it, so it's just Ashes Ashes.
mm,
Um, and the reason for that is because if you look at the historical map of Rikers Island, the original island before it was built up in the 19th century by the state, was just kind of like a thin strip of island. And then the way in which it was extended out to its current footprint is built up through ashes on each side, um, that are incinerated garbage, largely from Manhattan and the
no kidding.
surrounding settlement, that were used as landfill to expand the island to its current footprint. So you've got the original island, and there's ashes and ashes, and so that's where the partly where the title comes from.
Wow.
But then it also comes from kind of where degrees of visibility left me was uh, thinking about from a kind of abolitionist framework, thinking about what abolition not only as a way of getting rid of this structure or the violence of this site, but thinking about also what will replace it or um, what will grow in its place.
Mm,
And so that question that Ashes begins with, and was a kind of interview question that began each of my conversations with the different activists I interviewed for the piece, was what would you see? What would you like to see grow up from ruins of Rikers? And that's kind of like a composting question on a certain level. That compost is literally a kind of physiological process through which, or a biological process through which, you know, the ruins of things, degrade and transform into the basis of new life. And so, what can come of composting or of that kind of site? So the way in which I figured out the visual strategy uh, for Ashes Ashes was that I felt if I only showed images of the prison, uh, then you would what the image would do is just kind of reinforce what images of prisons already reinforced, which is a kind of carceral imaginary. I mean, I think it's important to get a sense of what prisons look like and to know what these spaces are, and to not be in denial of that, or look at the world through rose-colored glasses where we don't see these dramatic spaces. But at the same time, I think that there's a ideological function that the image of the prison and its bars and its razor wire um, confirm in us, which is that this is a space of danger. This is a space in which it's filled with people who are a threat to the rest of us. That really, we have to be careful that those images don't just reinforce that kind of thinking, even if we're trying to ask them to think of something else. And the same thing with portraiture. I think that um, uh, one of the ways in which one of the histories of portraiture, as someone like Alan Sekula um, is, asks us to think about, is the mugshot, and the way in which the kind of language of portraiture that's rooted in the state's photography of and surveillance of people is a way of getting us to be, transforms people into suspects, which is kind of the opposite side of the kind of liberal humanist tradition of portraiture, where we think it shows us something of someone's humanity, and it certainly can if it's presented in the right way, but it can also do the same thing that the image of the prison does by getting us to kind of, maybe we want someone to rethink their relationship to carcerality and so forth, but then the way we use our images just actually confirms the kind of racial stereotypes and the kind of criminalizing effect of that form of portraiture. So again, getting back to your sense of what it means to unthink those images.
Mm-hmm.
So with Ashes, what I tried to think of was, well, what would be images that would allow us to think what would grow in Riker's place. So the imagery is entirely shot at 5 different locations around the Upper East River that surround Rikers, from where you can see Rikers, but at the same time, they're wild spaces, or kind of parkland, or wild spaces where you can generally kind of see what kind of unauthorized forms of life are growing in those places that would be presumably the same forms of life that would replace the prison.
Right.
And so that becomes the imagery that primarily accompanies my conversations with different people in the video, and which also, along with different ruins of these kind of industrial former piers, or industrial kind of spaces, or settlement that we don't kind of know exactly what's there anymore, but there's just big lumps of concrete and things like that.
I really appreciate the way that you use the word unauthorized, because it just makes me think about, there's no authority, or not really any authority, over the what grows and where. And so it makes me think about, like, as you're saying, if you want to know what's going to come after, look at what came before, because history only repeats itself. And so I guess kind of like another thought that I had was, like when you're working out, I guess the muscles tear and then grow back even stronger. And so you put these gaps into where nature was, or like what was once there. You put these gaps there, and then eventually it'll return even stronger. Because, yeah. I mean, you see like abandoned houses, and they're all engulfed in leaves and collapsing beneath vegetation and all this stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you can decide if this is useful to use in the interview, but you could show an image of this from Degrees of Visibility that over it, which is wound up becoming kind of the coda to the piece, or it's kind of like the question mark at the end of the piece that then asks what will come next, which winds up being Ashes. And my first conversations with Nicole were around, thinking about what I could contribute to marking time. I kind of started with this image that when I was in the first exhibition of Degrees of Visibility was at a small nonprofit community gallery in Atlanta called Wonder Root. And somebody who came to the opening of the show asked me if I had been to the old Atlanta prison farm, and suggested I should go there. And it was a prison farm that was on land that had been kind of purchased by the state for use during World War I as a prisoner of war camp for German POWs, but was never used for that purpose. and then the land was given to the Department of Corrections because it was nearby one of the sorry, not the Department of Corrections, but the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which had a big prison nearby. And so they turned it into this a functioning farm for about half a century, and it closed in the around the end of the 1980s, I think. And so I went to document this and visit the space and kind of feel the energy of this space and think about the life and everything that had been there. And I kind of wondered as I started to photograph it if this would fit into degrees of visibility, because usually degree of visibility, every image within it is a landscape image in which you may or may not see the prison or jail within it, but then is always titled according to the number of people who are unfree in that landscape according to the state. um, and so, but this prison was empty, and it was not functioning anymore, and it was empty. And as I started to think about this prison being empty, looking looking at this kind of shell of a ruin of this old prison, and just seeing all of this kind of fugitive life, unauthorized life that was thriving off of its ruin, I realized that this is not empty at all, but it's very full. It's very full of life that, again, was making an amazing use of the kind of remnants and the ruin of this space. But it was kind of, an anti-carceral life,
Mm-hmm.
potentially. And so that's kind of where that idea really started for me, started to germinate, if that's not pushing the metaphor too.
No, not at all. That's a great. Yeah, and I think that really speaks to, the way in which that goes back to deconstructing the image and deconstructing the ideologies behind the image, because it expands our understanding of abolition and justice to something that's beyond humanity, something that already exists in a lot of different ways. And I think in decentering like what people think about people and what people think about structure and nature, it allows, like, I don't know, new thought like you're intending. So
Yeah.
that's awesome. So that answers the question of what the story of your work in relation to marking time is. How did you first come in contact with Nicole?
Um, well, the first time I came into contact with Nicole was a near miss. It was a conference about it's kind of within this conversation about the resurgence of and redefinition of aesthetics.
Hmm.
Kind of coming back after the critique of beauty from decades before within contemporary art. There were people looking to rethink what we mean by aesthetics, not just the experience of beauty, but the ways in which what we see or perceive or sense are linked with meaning. And so there was a conference that I think Nicole was going to be a part of, and I didn't know Nicole's work yet. It was my first introduction, but then she had to back out, and but it led me to her work because I read the text that she had shared with everybody, and which was the text, the Posing in Prisons text, and which really was just one of the really one of the best things I've read on photography in relation to carceral sites and so forth. And and then she reached out to me in the lead up to marking time, and that's when we actually had our first conversation.
Wow, that's incredible. I guess I'm just, the chance opportunity. What are the odds?
Yeah.
This is kind of going toward a different direction, but in an interview or in your TED talk, you were talking a lot about performance, and I think it's really interesting because generally when I think of performance, I think about people, and your work is largely centered around, or from what I've seen so far, it's largely centered around environments. How do you think performance and liveness relates to natural settings and I guess what you are currently doing in your work.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in that particular talk, I was thinking about um, performance as not just doing stuff, but that it's through the performance of patterns and um, ways of being in the world, ways of resisting things, ways of building things that we make the world. And so a lot of the work that I've done, my collaborative work with dancer and artist Taisha Paget, is really rooted in that kind of thinking about the performativity and performance of identity and the body and the ways in which those make possibility. Um, and I think that in relation to the work around environments that you're thinking of, I mean, there's kind of two. I mean, one is around like ashes, ashes, for example, and thinking about um, that that my interest in how I'm looking at the kind of um, natural or kind of wild environments along the shoreline of the East River across from Rikers. I I'm interested in what's being performed
Mm.
in a sense. Uh, Not performance in terms of like for a viewer per se, but performing tasks, performing life,
Mm.
and building up new kinds of structures and communities and I guess there's a way in which I um, that it's in that same kind of performance that in our communities we we undo the structures that we are interpolated into or presented with so as not to question them or to submit to them, and we find ways to undo them. Because
Mm.
I think I mean, there's one kind of rebellion or resistance that's to just simply say no, or uh, to voice our dissent. But it's another to actually build what is
Mm.
not supposed to be built in ways that those things get built.
Right.
um, and to it also helps us understand, I think, the mechanisms of power when it comes to the way in which things get unbuilt,
Mm-hmm.
strategically, whether that's historical communities that have been destroyed, or I mean, about 10-15 years ago here in Los Angeles was this really kind of catastrophic moment where the South Central Farm was destroyed by the city, and uh, which was a which was a place for growing food. It was a community garden that was established in the wake of the LA rebellion of the early 90s, and as a way of kind of both community healing and the community giving space for the community to provide for itself.
Mm.
And why the state would um, would allow for the destruction of that space at a time in which the kind of racial stereotypes of South Central Los Angeles was always that it's filled with people who don't want to provide for themselves. Here was an example of
Mm-hmm.
people absolutely making the world they want and need,
Mm.
and uh, it was that was taken apart and destroyed. So I think that kind of performance, I guess, is something that where we can see how it is that little things matter, not
Mm.
just the big tearing down of something, but the small building up of new sites of resistance, moments of community, new forms of analysis that will, none of which alone will change the world by themselves, but as they come together and perform together, I think seeing that as a model of change is something that's at least I try to work with and makes sense to me.
Mm.
And at the same time, it helps us understand the kind of ways in which power tries to destroy those things at the same time, and we have to look for those things, and be suspicious of where we can, those things where we can catch them before they get too far.
Yeah. Um, and that what you were saying about the garden in South Central LA and how the state was enabling its destruction, that really makes me think about, how you're talking about performances beyond an action. Performance is also beyond an image, and so I'm thinking about how in allowing that destruction of a community site, it also maintains the image of people who are incapable of being self-sustaining and self-sufficient. So that made me think about how your work is also speaking to um, deconstructing those images that are constantly being reinforced by oppressive systems. So it's really cool. um, where so it also seems that like your work is very much intellectual and based in historical events and photographic theory. Where do you see yourself in your work, and where do you feel like the feeling or your emotions take root? Do they take root there?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a big part of the fuel for my work.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, I I think there's a few reasons. I'm let's see. One of the things that there's a couple of aspects to this. There's a certain place where I think speaking in the first person in my work has has an important role, but um, I've also, especially once I started doing work around the prison system 2 decades ago, I even though I have my own kind of personal ways in which I've come to that work, I've also felt that the majority of people who are affected by the system are not people who look like me or grew up in the, kind of generally white middle class suburb in kind of community. And so it was always important to me that I didn't make the story at some point just be about me. Um, and and at the same time, so that was always, there was a kind of question of a kind of narrative authority that um, I never wanted my voice to be more important than the voices of the people I was working with or interviewing. Um, uh, and there's a part of the work that is always kind of motivated by my own commitment to um, I feel like the kind of anti-racist education that I've received in my lifetime, been lucky to receive from the schools I went to and mentors that I've had, um,
Hmm.
and there's a kind of commitment to that work that I feel is my role, to not just have benefited from that, but but um, but also to continue pushing that and continue developing that, uh, and so I always feel that there's some way in which I need to contribute back to that. And it's also, I also feel like, really, like, personally, as um, someone who's really been important to me in understanding the world and what I can do as an artist, is James Baldwin. James Baldwin's work has always been so important to me, and one of the aspects of it was the way in which he portrayed whiteness, um, which is much better than, I think, maybe any white folks I know in terms of trying to describe their own whiteness.
Hmm.
But in part because of he really challenges this idea that that while with whiteness comes a very definite sort of privilege, that that privilege comes at a tremendous cost of one's own humanity,
Hmm.
um, and and uh, and so working from the place, I mean, there's a moment that's always been really important to me, also in terms of thinking about documentary, in his Evidence of Things Not Seen, where he
Mm-hmm.
talks about the jailer and the prisoner and the jailer,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about how important it is not to speak from the position of a victim, because it's the moaning of the victim or the cries of the victim that confirm to the jailer their own power. And and so that's always helped me understand, on one hand, that one of the roles of art and that I can play is to trouble that sense of power, or that confirmation of power for the jailer. And by
Ah.
that, by the jailer there, I don't just mean people who work in corrections,
Oh.
but I also mean people who, you know, benefit from the histories of racism in ways that they don't reflect on or try to challenge.
Right. Um, and again, that kind of goes back to what you were saying about deconstructing images and the image of what it means to express one's experiences and to have them be interpreted as like expressions of victimhood in a way rather than just simple expressions of one's experiences. Does that speak to what you were saying, or when?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I mean, the work, I'm not sure if you know this work, but before Degrees of Visibility, the my primary work around the prison system was really kind of even much more directly activist based,
Hmm.
even though Degrees of Visibility and Ashes and my newer piece, Undoing Time, Double Time, sorry, which I see as a kind, which is very intentionally a kind of follow up to Ashes, based in Arizona, around another prison that's being closed down, and working with some activists to think about what that could mean. Um, but that working with people who are engaged in the work of actually fighting the system, and uh, very much countering that kind of image of victimhood, people who refuse to be victims or let them, you know, um, or or have been victimized but refuse to, you know, let that be the end of the story for them.
Hmm.
Um, that work has been very much based in that, and my work in there was also, I think, very much about kind of bringing my camera and my microphone and my abilities and my access and privilege with having some equipment and some training and all this, and being able to sit down and sit down and shut up and listen, which was something that, which is a phrase I learned from Curtis Muhammad, who died recently,
Hmm.
who was an organizer in New Orleans and a former member of SNCC, and a union organizer for a long time. Um, yeah.
Beautiful. Um, I do have two questions now. Thinking back to what you were saying about your, I guess, methodology in a way of approaching your work and kind of understanding your place in this work is kind of derived from your own mentors, your own teachers, those you look up to. What sorts of foundations do you think that you're building for future photographers and, um, yeah, or just future artists and activists and thinkers around abolition?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess the foundations, I can speak to the foundations I would like to be building. um, uh, I mean, some of it I would define in terms of making space for a certain kind of approach as an artist um, to having a critical relationship to to images, and to um, remaining. I mean, I think there's been some kind of backlash against, you know, the critiques of photography in recent years that have been um, as if it's about not liking photography or not wanting to look or things like that. But I think that um, there's some good critique or reminders of the importance of what we do see in the image, and the pleasure of seeing and so forth. But I think that it doesn't take away from, you know, not only thinking about images in terms of what we see in them, but to also thinking about what I think someone like Stuart Hall would ask us to do, is that to think about that images also have an effect. So to be asking, what are the effects of these images? What are these images doing aside from what I feel like they're showing me, or how they're making me feel on a basic level? So sometimes that's not as glamorous or fun or easy work. And so I guess one foundation would be trying to make space for other artists who want to continue to work in that way. Um, I think also, I think there's also, maybe more important though, is, I mean, I teach in a kind of major art school at Cal Arts, which um, uh, is a place like most art schools where historically um, there's a value around critical thinking and critical critical theory and things like that. But there is a suspicion around being politically involved in one's work that I think is, um, well, I think it's just bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think that there's, and I think one of the ways I try to make space for students in teaching is for them to be suspicious of the discipline of art and the desire of the contemporary art world or other art worlds to want to detach ourselves from art from the larger political world. And I think that um, and I think that right now there's a tremendous opening where there are a lot of people who haven't had access to art school before and to the art world in ways we haven't had access to before. And I think that we have to be careful about the kind of lure of contemporary art, which is really kind of capitalist and wants kind of products that are kind of smooth and alienated from political life, that allow people to, and I think that uneasy place of being between using art not to transcend or escape our political daily lives and realities, but to take them on, and to try to create a kind of generous and challenging space for viewers in which they too can find the courage and the will to take on difficult questions. Um, I would hope that I'm not creating this foundation, but I hope I'm extending the foundation that others before me have created, in which we can continue to take those things up.
Yeah.
Because there's, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I don't know what Nicole thinks about this so much, but there's a kind of historical trend towards an interest in, criminal justice reform, and that's propelled by, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in the last decade and a half, and that has made museums like PS1 and MoMA, want to take on shows like Marking Time, but that wasn't always the case, and it's quite possible it might not be the case again at some point, where there aren't the kind of social forces and cultural forces to make that will within big institutions, and we just go back to supporting the art market in a way that, we did our good duty last decade. This decade we can just get back to, not confronting difficult things.
Yeah.
But so I think as artists, it's really important for us to also be pushing for that space and asking those tough questions.
And that makes it's the neoliberal machine, because as language is developed and steps are taken and questions are answered, um, like as you're speaking about criminal justice reform and the Black Lives Matter movement, and just seeing the way that Black Lives Matter as a movement was co-opted by just large capitalistic country or companies and industries. I think the question of abolition in art and in institutions as what's next is, I don't know. I really appreciate, or I'm I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but it's really cool to, I guess, witness a lot of work being made in this direction, and to witness like people like you who are laying these stepping stones and who are stepping on, I guess, the ones before you, and creating new foundations. And so that also brings me to one, how have other artists in marking time kind of shifted your thinking in ways?
So there's works like, I mean, like Keith Calhoun and China McCormick, whose work I've admired for a long time, and have really admired their kind of using their place and their tools to stay engaged over a long time, not just when matters of criminal justice or changes to the prison system are kind of fashionable.
Hmm.
Um, and and that's been incredible. And I think someone like Maria Gaspar, as well as someone who I've known for a number of years, and our work has also moved through some of these circuits of the kind
Hmm.
of prison exhibitions that have kind of cropped up in the last 10 years. But also her engagement with community, and also kind of really starting from a personal place in her work. I really admired how she kind of moves through the through the world. I think there's a lot of other artists in. I mean, the majority of artists, though, in marking time come come at this from a really different position
Hmm.
than me, and are more working from their own experience. And I think contradictorily, there's been a way in which that's the kind of position of authorship that I've tried to be careful I don't slip into for myself, because again, like I'm saying, like that's there my work. I don't feel like my work should ever be about making it my story. There are moments where how it becomes my story here or there are important to talk about, but I don't. I think there's a kind of personal voice, though, that I feel like my energy needs to be more around the place of how I'm able to describe systems. And I mean, that's something else we haven't really talked about, but that's always been like, that's where a lot of my work that is more mapping oriented and stuff like that comes from, is really descriptive systems and things that we don't see with the eye. Um, but thinking about, uh, Tamika Cole's work, um, or Jesse Crimes' work, or James Yaya Huff's work. I mean, people like that, I think they're people whose work I really admire, and learn a lot from. Uh, and I'm really just grateful to kind of that my work, that what I'm making is also has this place alongside what they have to say. I think there's also something around the there's also something that I've been wanting to know more about as I'm starting to get to know some of the other artists, because during COVID I never really got to meet a lot of folks.
Mm.
Um, uh, but I know, like, the efforts the efforts by Jesse Crimes and others to kind of create these new additional platforms and foundations on which
Mm.
to give other formerly incarcerated artists the chance to, you know, build their work and have their work seen and have opportunities. Um, that kind of redistribution of resources is something um, that I think is also really important to me. I think um, one of the reasons that my work is not filled with my own personal voice is to make space for other people's voices, and there's something redistributive there that I've learned over the years, and I think one of the things I admire in seeing some of the networks come out of Marking Time
Mm.
is that ability to kind of, you know, see what kind of resources are coming in and how those can be built to lift up other folks, not just to become one person's capital, but to become, you know, the basis for the next group of people and so forth. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and that also answers, the question that I had about how marking time has influenced your understanding or your approach to community as well. So, thank you. If you want to elaborate on that portion or that question as well, feel free to. But
In terms of community?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, community's always been a really important kind of question in relation to my work and thinking
Mm.
about uh, just on a fundamental level that even though oftentimes my work might start from a really personal, individuated place, that I think for me, art is also about a place in which one bridges that personal interior space or experience with a public or a community. And
Hmm.
there's so I've always found it important to try to think of in making my work, what is the community of what is the community of people, whether those are other artists, other thinkers, people who are most affected by the issues I'm taking up, and so forth. What is that community on the front end that I'm speaking with or thinking alongside um, or can engage or can see if they would want to have a conversation with me.
Hmm.
Um, but I think also on the level of what the work has the potential to do, there's I think there's also a way in which one thing it has the potential to do is to split up that voice
Hmm. Oh.
and to go from being kind of mono vocal to polyvocal. And so documentaries, one of the reasons I've always appreciated documentary uh, and worked in that mode in one way or other is because of the space for multiple voices to be brought together, and sometimes the role of the documentarian as a kind of curator of voices rather than just, you know, speaking their own individuated voice and experience. But then I also see so there's a place for that kind of redistributive relationship to authorship that takes place. And I've also really admired how community spaces do that. Like one of the spaces I most enjoyed working with throughout my career was Project Row Houses in Houston,
Hmm.
which was, you know, continues to be kind of the brainchild of a number of artists who were uh, who both came out of a kind of discoursive community-based practice and that later kind of transformed into ideas of social practice, uh, and but really thought about what can a different kind of infrastructure position differently within a community uh, in relation to art making do for that community. Um, and so the way in which, I mean, I think one of the things I always loved about how they conceived of that was not only to have, you know, this set of old row houses that they rehabilitated with arts funding to become these small galleries along this block in the third ward, but that alongside of that, they also started kind of community-based programs for arts programming for kids in the neighborhood. Also, this amazing program called the Young Mothers Program that was also would give a kind of residency to young mothers who were in school and would give kind of support and also a community of other mothers to be in dialogue with, and also a kind of community board that would inform Project Row House's development and its changes and so forth. And they even then started to think about their role in making sure that they wouldn't become a gentrifying force, as
Mm.
most art institutions often become. And so one of the first public campaigns they were a part of was an anti-gentrification campaign in the third ward. The third ward's not for sale, which is a historically Black community in Houston. And so I think that broader sense of that art is not just about this work in this little gallery and the private, the individuals who come to see it, but it's also about a larger role in developing community and making space where people be a part of that community, and looking out for the health and welfare of that community as well. That's a part of what art institutions can do. I think that's really important. Then the other thing I would just say is that I think one of the things that art does, and I've kind of written about this in places and some places, is think about the way in which artworks create a kind of temporary community among viewers who are kind of sharing a time and space or an experience of a work in relation to their surroundings and the larger community that they're in. And that there's a moment there where they might be able to reconceive their relationship to each other, or to be able to do something together. And I think so it's one thing to think of art as showing community or reflecting the ideals of community, or being even more importantly, built out of community. But then it's another thing to think that one of the effects that art can have is in building community and contributing to strong communities, which, I think interestingly is one of the most important questions of abolition. Not just thinking about what kind of things you want to tear down, but what are the forms of community that will be built up, against that kind of carceral set of relationships. And those are the questions that I think, people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Ashes really brings up most importantly, and Shane Aged and the folks who were a part of the No New Jails coalition in New York that worked to struggle for the closure of Rikers.
Yeah.
Among many other people. There's a lot of people who contributed to that.
Yeah. Which actually kind of leads into my next question, which is, and like this as a closing question, what kinds of people and organizations are you involved with right now for your work, and where do you hope to see your work go from here?
Right now I continue to maintain relationships with some of the organizations that have been a part of, some of the collaborations we've done recently. This last year, I was able to get to know this organization in Arizona called Mass Liberation Arizona, who is doing really incredible work, both abolitionist organizing and that in relation to voter enfranchisement, against disenfranchisement, and also looking to work against, push recall efforts against prosecutors who've been contributing to, mass imprisonment in Arizona. Continuing to work with Critical Resistance, which has been, one of the most important organizations I've worked with, since the beginning of my work. I think, over the last 22 years. I'm also, I think my teaching, sometimes I forget that I'm involved in an organization that is a teaching organization, is also an institution that also, also needs its own abolitionist approaches and anti-racist approaches to how we remake ourselves into the going into the future. And I mean, I think for each of us thinking about where do we pick up work that's nearby us, that's been a place for me to try to get involved in not just teaching my classes, but also being involved in the dialogues that help shape the future of the Institute, and respond to the students who don't feel as served historically by the Institute, which is primarily, students of color and first generation college students, things like that. Um, uh, I've also got my kid in preschool, which is another form of organization in the community. And it's just kind of, getting to know parents who are a part of, this orbit, and, preparing to think about getting our little one involved in the public education system when he's old enough. He's just 3 right now. And that being a site of, involvement in the community. And I don't know, those are other places that are not typically on my map in that way, but they feel important. They feel important right now. You've got this, you start to bring little ones into the world, and you just got this community of people that you start building the world around them. And I think it's really important to reflect on some of these same questions there in the same way.
Gotcha. Wow.
Yeah.
Those are all, you presented a lot of very new thoughts to me. So I'm really grateful for the time and just the knowledge and the information and the passion that you shared on this brief conversation today. So thank you very much.